I parked my old Honda at the far edge of the parking lot, away from the entrance. It was 23 years old, and the paint on the hood was peeling, but the engine worked well, and I wasn't going to replace it. Why spend money on something that was doing its job? Besides, I was used to this car, the squeaky seats, the way it rumbled at idle. Ray bought it used back in 2002, drove it to work, then handed it over to me when he hardly ever drove it himself. The day was warm for mid-October. The sun was shining brightly, but not burning. The air was fresh, with a light breeze. I took a knitted sweater from the salon, just in case, as air conditioning is often turned on too much indoors, and headed for the entrance. The restaurant looked exactly the same as it had 3 months ago, when I'd stopped in briefly to meet with Clarence and discuss new contracts with suppliers. The sign was freshly painted, the windows were clean, and the last of the fall asters, purple and pale pink, were blooming in large ceramic tubs by the entrance. It was nice to see that everything was kept in order. Inside smelled of something spicy and appetizing. Cinnamon and caramelized onions, I think. I stopped on the threshold, looking around. The room was about half full, the usual pattern for a Wednesday, a weekday without holidays or weekends. People of all ages were sitting at the tables, talking softly, dishes clinking, music playing quietly somewhere. Everything looked alive and real, without that fake theatricality which sometimes tried to create in establishments designed for a rich audience. A young girl came up to me with a menu in her hands. I didn't know her. She must be new. Her face was pleasant, open. Her blonde hair was gathered in a ponytail. She smiled welcomingly, but without too much enthusiasm, as well-trained staff should. "Good afternoon. Table for one?" "Yes, please. Preferably by the window, if there's one available." She nodded and led me through the hall. I followed, looking at the interior. The walls were painted the same light beige color as before, and on the shelves were simple ceramic vases with dried flowers, wheat ears, some twigs with dried berries. Nothing flashy, nothing flashy. That's the atmosphere Ray and I wanted to create when we opened. A place where you could come after work, have a quiet dinner without pretense, as he used to say, mixing Russian and English words. Ray liked foreign words in general, though he knew only high school Spanish, and that with a pinch of salt. He had been a foreman all his life, a simple and straightforward man, but he could appreciate beauty and harmony. The girl sat me down at a table by a large window overlooking the street. I made myself comfortable and put my sweater on the back of the chair. I was wearing old jeans and a simple blue cotton blouse, with worn sneakers on my feet. I probably looked like an ordinary pensioner who had decided to treat herself to lunch at a decent place. Well, that's the way it was, actually. I'm 73 years old, a widow, living alone in an old house on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy. I already knew the menu by heart, but I ran my eyes over the pages anyway. The manager, Clarence, had called recently, saying they'd added a couple new items, something with pumpkin and a pear. Fall dishes, seasonal. I found them in the salads and hot items section. The descriptions looked appetizing. Pumpkin puree soup with ginger and sour cream. Salad with caramelized pear and blue mold cheese. "What will you order?" The girl came back with a notebook at the ready. "Pumpkin puree soup and sparkling water, please." She wrote it down, took the menu, and left. I leaned on the table, looking out the window. People were walking down the sidewalk, some in a hurry, some taking their time. A woman with a stroller stopped at the window of a neighboring store, gazing at the mannequins on display. Two teenagers passed by on skateboards, talking loudly. Just a normal weekday in Wilmington, nothing special. I hadn't been here in a while. The last time I'd stopped by was in July, just before Clarence's vacation, to make sure everything was going well. I'd been sitting at this table then too, ordering a shrimp salad and a glass of white wine. Clarence had been running the restaurant for 8 years, and I'd never once regretted hiring him. He was meticulous, neat, and had a way with the staff and the vendors. I paid him a good salary and did not interfere in the current affairs, just called once every 2 weeks to discuss figures, plans, possible changes in the menu or in the schedule. They brought me water in a tall glass with ice cubes and a basket of bread. I broke off a slice, chewing slowly. The bread was fresh, with a crisp crust and a soft, spongy crumb. The bakery we worked with was right here in Wilmington, baking the old-fashioned way, with sourdough. Ray used to go there himself, negotiate deliveries, taste the different varieties, pick them out. He was the soul of the place. He'd come up with the menu, choose the suppliers, argue with the designer about the color of the walls. And I did the paperwork, the bookkeeping, all those boring but necessary things. We complemented each other. 28 years ago, we opened in a tiny space on the edge of town, almost an industrial zone. Ray had just retired after 30 years as a construction foreman, and I was still working as an inspector for the IRS. But I was thinking about quitting. Both of us had been saving for years, saving little by little. The restaurant was our dream, our project for our old age. We wanted to make something of our own, something that would outlive both of us, something that would remain after us in this city. The first few years were hard. We worked alone, almost without weekends, cooking, catering, scrubbing floors at night. Douglas was already living on his own, working as an insurance agent, and had his own life. Sometimes he came to see us, but he didn't show much interest in our endeavor. He said that it was too troublesome and nerve-wracking, that he didn't understand why we needed it at our age. Maybe that's true. But Ray and I loved that hustle, that rhythm, that tiredness at the end of the day when you realize you've done something with your hands. 5 years later, we moved to our current space, bigger, in a more crowded neighborhood, closer to downtown. Things got better. We hired a cook, 2 waiters, a dishwasher. I quit the IRS for good, took over the restaurant. Ray blossomed in front of my eyes. He loved talking to the guests, memorized the regulars, joked with them, was interested in their lives. He had this ability to make people feel at home. The soup came in a deep white bowl with a spoonful of sour cream in the middle and a pinch of pumpkin seeds on top. It smelled incredible, sweet, spicy, with a warm aroma of cinnamon and ginger. I tasted it, thick, velvety, with a slight sweetness of pumpkin and a slightly noticeable spice of ginger. Clarence had worked well with the cook, and the recipe was a success. Ray would approve. I ate slowly, taking my time, looking around the room. The staff moved quietly, not fussy, but not lethargic either. The waiters came to the tables on time, cleared away the dirty dishes quickly, without too much noise. The cook, to all appearances, coped with the flow of orders without delays. People received dishes and started eating. No one drummed their fingers on the table in anticipation. At a neighboring table sat an elderly couple, quietly talking about something without looking at each other. Farther away, a group of 3 middle-aged women were laughing about something, one showing the other's pictures on her phone. I remembered how Ray had sat here at this table 10 years ago, shortly before he died, and said to me, "Evie, if I leave before you do, don't close this place. It's alive, you know. It's breathing. Let it keep breathing." I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to think about it. And 6 months later, he was gone. His heart failed. A heart attack, right here in the kitchen, when he was checking how things were going with a new batch of meat. After he died, I tried to run everything myself for 2 more years, but I realized I was running out of steam. Too many things: staff, suppliers, taxes, repairs, complaints, force majeure. So I hired Clarence, and I gradually moved away from the day-to-day. I left only the major decisions and control of finances to myself. The restaurant kept running, brought in a steady income, I lived on that money and didn't need anything, although I didn't throw it around. Douglas was never really interested in what I was doing. When Ray died, his son came to the funeral, sat with me for a couple days, helped me sort through his father's things, then went back to his life. Sometimes he asked me how I was doing, if I had enough money, but they were general routine questions. I answered briefly, "Everything is fine. I live a little." He didn't ask for details, and I didn't tell him. It seemed to me that he wasn't particularly interested. When Douglas married Priscilla 3 years ago, I came to the wedding, a modest celebration at a country club, 50 guests. Priscilla was elegant, in a cream dress, dignified, smiling demurely. She greeted me politely, but without warmth. All evening I felt superfluous. I sat at a distant table with some distant relatives of Douglas, whom I saw for the first time. Douglas came over a couple of times, asked if I was all right, if I was bored, but quickly went back to his guests. I didn't see them much from then on. A couple times at Douglas's birthday party, once at Christmas. Priscilla was emphatically cold to me, not overtly rude, but she made it clear that she wasn't looking for my company. Douglas pretended not to notice anything and turned the conversation to neutral topics, the weather, the news, renovations to their house. I didn't take offense. Adults have their own lives, their own priorities. I just accepted it as a given and stopped expecting anything more. I finished my soup, blotted my lips with a napkin. The waitress came over, took my plate, asked if I wanted dessert or coffee. I declined, asking only for the bill. She nodded and went back to the counter. I sat there for another 10 minutes, finishing my water, looking outside. It felt good to be here, in this place, where so many years of life had been left behind, so much labor put in. Ray would be pleased to see how things had turned out. The restaurant lived, worked, fed people, gave them a place to relax and eat proper food. That was the main thing. Not profit, not fame, not prestige, just that the business was going on. I was finishing my water when the door of the restaurant opened and two men appeared on the doorstep. Douglas and Priscilla. I froze, glass in hand, not believing my eyes. What were they doing here? In the middle of the workday? On a Wednesday? Douglas held the door, letting his wife pass through. Priscilla walked through, looking around with the air of someone assessing the surroundings. She was wearing a light-colored pantsuit, low-heeled shoes, her hair impeccably styled, every strand in its proper place. Douglas looked ordinary, gray slacks, dark shirt, slightly wrinkled at the elbows. He was always sloppier than his wife. It was obvious whenever I saw them together. I slowly set the glass down on the table. My heart beat a little faster, even though nothing terrible was happening. It was just a surprise. I hadn't been prepared for the meeting, hadn't expected to see them here in my restaurant. The hostess, the same girl who greeted me, approached them with two menus. Priscilla said something to her. The girl nodded and led them across the room. I sat motionless, hoping they would pass by without noticing me. The table by the window where I was sitting wasn't the most conspicuous, and you wouldn't see it if you didn't look closely. But Priscilla did. She was always looking at everything around her, people, surroundings, details. Her gaze slid around the room, caught my table, and I saw her face stiffen in surprise for a moment. Then her lips pressed into a thin line, and she stopped, making the hostess stop too. Evelyn? She said my name as if she'd discovered something completely out of place in this place. Douglas turned around, and his face showed the same surprise, but without the irritation, more like confusion mixed with a touch of embarrassment. Mom? He took a step toward me. What are you doing here? Lunch, I answered calmly, trying to keep my voice steady. And you? We decided to have lunch, too, Priscilla said in her husband's place, and the hostess shifted awkwardly beside them, not knowing whether to lead them on or wait. I've heard good things about this place. Decided to give it a try. She looked me over from head to toe with a quick, appraising gaze. I could see her eyes catching on my simple blouse, on the knit sweater on the back of the chair, on the worn sneakers under the table. I didn't expect to see you here, though, she added, and there was something akin to bewilderment in her voice. Why not? I shrugged. The food here is good. Yes, of course. Priscilla smiled, but the smile didn't touch her eyes. It's just, well, it's a pretty expensive place, from what I understand. I thought you'd prefer something simpler, more on a budget. Douglas tugged lightly on her elbow, clearly trying to stop her, but she paid no attention. The hostess continued to stand nearby, looking away, pretending not to hear the conversation. Sometimes you can afford it, I said. Yeah, sure, Priscilla nodded. Everyone wants something special sometimes. The important thing is not to overdo it, isn't it? At your age, you have to be careful what you spend. Her tone was the same condescension I'd grown accustomed to in 3 years. She spoke to me as if I were a child who needed gentle guidance, or someone who didn't quite understand how life worked and needed an explanation. Are you alone? Douglas asked, and there was something like worry in his voice. He was always worried about these things, about whether I was alone, whether I was bored, whether everything was all right. But his concern was superficial, off duty, like asking about the health of an acquaintance you met on the street. Yes, alone. Shall we have lunch together? He looked at his wife for support, but Priscilla only frowned slightly, and I realized that she didn't like the suggestion at all. I've already eaten, I said. But thank you. Oh, okay, Douglas nodded with obvious relief. Priscilla turned to the hostess, about to continue on her way to her table, but then she turned around again, as if she'd remembered something important. By the way, Evelyn, she tilted her head to the side, feigning friendly interest. How often do you come here? Must be a special occasion? A birthday or something? No, it's not a special occasion, I replied. Really? Priscilla raised her eyebrows. You're just treating yourself? That's nice. I guess you have to save up for months to afford a meal like this, though, huh? I saw the prices on the menu when I was looking for reviews. Her voice sounded light, almost friendly, with a slight note of sympathy. But I could hear the mockery hidden beneath that lightness. Douglas tugged her arm again, a little harder this time. Priscilla, don't what? She opened her eyes innocently, looking up at him. I'm just curious. We're family, aren't we? We should know how our mom's doing, how she's living, what she's spending her money on. It's a normal concern. I'm fine, I said flatly. Thank you for your concern. Of course, of course. Priscilla nodded, and her voice became even sweeter. It's just, we're worried. The pension's small. Life's getting more expensive every day. All these bills, medicines, repairs. At your age, you have to make every penny count, don't you? It's normal. There's no shame in it. She sounded like she was comforting me, like I should have been grateful that she recognized my poverty as something natural and not to be judged. You can always ask us for help if you need it, she continued, lowering her voice to a confidential whisper, even though the hostess was standing 2 feet away and could probably hear everything. Isn't that right, Douglas? We're not gonna let your mom starve or skimp on the essentials. Douglas nodded, but he looked unhappy. He was looking away, clearly wanting this conversation to end as soon as possible. He was always like that when Priscilla spoke to me in that tone. Silent, averting his eyes, waiting for it to be over. Never stepped in, never stopped her, never said, "Stop it, Priscilla. Leave your mother alone." "You don't need help," I said. "It's all right." Well, that's wonderful. Priscilla smiled broadly. So the pension is enough. That's good. I'm still surprised you're willing to spend money on a place like this, though. Usually, people in your position go for something more affordable. Cafes, diners, they have bigger portions and nicer prices. You can eat for 3 days for the same money. I like it here, I said. Of course you do. Priscilla nodded indulgently. Sometimes it's nice to feel, you know, like you can afford the same things as other people, the ones who are doing better. It's uplifting, I know. It's important to pamper yourself once in a while, even if it's not exactly financially wise. Douglas finally looked at me. Something flashed in his eyes, shaming, embarrassment, pity, but he didn't say anything. He just stood next to his wife and was as silent as ever. Well, we won't stop you from finishing your meal, Priscilla said, turning to the hostess. Can we go to the table now? I'm starving. The hostess nodded with obvious relief and led them on to the opposite end of the room. Priscilla walked ahead, looking around, Douglas following. He turned around once, looked at me apologetically, but said nothing. I remained seated at my table. My hands trembled slightly, not from anger, more from that strange feeling I always got after talking to Priscilla, like I'd been dipped in something sticky and unpleasant, something I wanted to get rid of as soon as possible. The waitress, the one who'd brought me the soup, was walking by with a tray. I caught her eye. Could I have some more water, please? Sure, she nodded, and a moment later, she brought a full glass. I drank slowly, looking out the window. There were people walking down the street, cars driving, everything as usual. An ordinary day, an ordinary life. And I'm sitting in my restaurant, and my sister-in-law is telling me how I should save money and not splurge on expensive dinners. Douglas didn't know it was my restaurant. When Ray and I first opened, my son was already living apart, working, rarely stopping by. We told him we were in the business, but he didn't really get into it. He'd nod, ask politely how we were doing, and we'd say fine. That was the end of the conversation. Douglas was never interested in details, never asked where exactly the restaurant was, what it was called, what was on the menu. To him, it was just another of his parents' retirement ventures, something unimportant and unworthy of attention. When Ray died, I didn't explain anything to my son. I just told him I could manage, that I had savings. He didn't ask where the savings came from, how much. He just took it for granted and stopped worrying. Priscilla must have gotten her impression of me from what she saw. An old house in the suburbs, a 23-year-old car, simple clothes from ordinary stores, a logical conclusion for someone who judges people by their appearance, a poor pensioner who can barely make ends meet, and she treated me accordingly, with that mixture of condescension and pity that those who consider themselves superior feel. I looked in their direction. Priscilla and Douglas were sitting at a table against the opposite wall, studying the menu. Priscilla was saying something, pointing her finger at a page, and Douglas was nodding, probably picking out dishes. From the ones Ray had once devised, from the ones the cooks Clarence had hired, the restaurant I'd kept afloat for 10 years after my husband died. I finished my water. The bill was on the table in a leather folder, and I'd already paid so I could leave. But for some reason, I didn't feel like getting up. I just wanted to sit there a little longer, to watch them order their food, to watch the dishes being brought to them, to watch them eat without realizing where they were. I continued to sit at my table, finishing my water. Priscilla and Douglas were seated against the opposite wall. The waitress brought them menus, and they began to study the pages. I watched them out of the corner of my eye, not turning my head. Priscilla held the menu in her outstretched arms, reading, frowning. Douglas was looking at his own, but his gaze was unfocused, clearly thinking about something else. After about 5 minutes, Priscilla raised her head and looked in my direction. I turned away to the window, but I could feel her gaze on me, a hard, displeased look. She said something to Douglas, and he answered without looking up from the menu. Priscilla raised her voice. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was sharp. Douglas shrugged, putting the menu on the table. Priscilla stood up and walked toward my table. I watched her walk, a quick stride with a straight back, chin raised. Her face was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. She came to a stop next to my desk, arms crossed over her chest. "Evelyn," she said, and her voice sounded cold. "I need to talk to you." I looked up at her. "I'm listening." "You see?" She leaned a little closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "We came here for lunch, just to have a quiet lunch, to spend some time together. And you're sitting here and ruining our mood." I didn't say anything, looking at her. "Your presence makes things awkward," Priscilla continued. "For everyone. For you too, I'm sure. Aren't you uncomfortable? Sitting here, knowing that we're watching you, that you're the only single woman in the room?" "I'm comfortable," I answered calmly. "You are?" Priscilla straightened, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "All right, then let me be direct. I don't like you being here. I don't like the way you're ruining our lunch. Would you mind sitting down, somewhere far away where we can't see each other?" I slowly put my glass down on the table. "There are empty tables here," I said. "You can sit by yourself if it's important to you." Priscilla flared up. Her cheeks flushed red, her eyes narrowed. "Are you serious? We were here first. We've already been seated. We've had water brought to us. And now you're suggesting we change seats because of you." "I didn't suggest you move," I countered. "You suggested it to me." "Because it's reasonable." Priscilla's voice grew louder, and several people at neighboring tables turned around. "You're alone. You don't care where you sit. And we're a couple. We care about the atmosphere. You're just selfish, Evelyn. You always have been." I didn't answer. I just sat there looking at her. Priscilla stood for a few more seconds, then turned around and went back to her desk. Douglas asked her something, and she waved him away, slumped back in her chair. The waitress came to their table and took out a notebook. Priscilla ordered something in a sharp tone. Douglas added his order quietly. The waitress nodded and left. Priscilla sat, glaring at me across the room. I turned away to the window. About 10 minutes passed. They brought me the bill. I'd already paid earlier, but the folder was still on the table. I could have gotten up and left at any moment, but something held me in place. Stubbornness, maybe, or just an unwillingness to give in. Priscilla and Douglas were brought appetizers, some kind of salad, bread, butter. Priscilla picked at her plate with her fork, barely eating. Douglas chewed silently, not looking up. The atmosphere at their table was tense even from a distance. Suddenly, Priscilla stood up again. This time, she walked even faster, her face completely red. She flew over to my desk and slapped her palm on the tabletop. "You're still here," she shouted. "Why are you still here?" Several diners froze with forks halfway to their mouths. Silence reigned. "I have a right to be here," I said quietly. "A right?" Priscilla laughed hysterically. "What right? You paid for lunch. You ate. Now get out. Make room for normal people." "Priscilla, please calm down." Douglas came up behind her and tried to take her hand, but she pulled away. "No, I will not calm down." She turned to the hall, her voice ringing with indignation. "She's been sitting here for an hour. She's already eaten. She's already paid, but she's still sitting there. And she's ruining everyone's mood with her pathetic appearance." The people at the tables looked at each other. Some averted their eyes. Some stared at us openly. "Maybe you'd better sit down," Douglas said quietly to his wife. "People are watching." "Let them look." Priscilla turned to me. "Evelyn, I'm asking you one last time. Go away. Just get up and walk away. Don't humiliate yourself any further." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice harder than I'd expected. "I have the right to be here as long as I want." Priscilla froze, staring at me in disbelief. Then her face contorted with rage. All right. She straightened up sharply. All right. Since you won't leave on your own, you'll be taken out. She turned around and shouted loudly towards the kitchen. Security, manager, somebody. The whole room froze. The waitress who was carrying a tray of food stopped halfway through. The cook looked out of the kitchen. Douglas grabbed his wife by the shoulders, trying to pull her away, but she lashed out. Where's the manager in here? Priscilla shouted, addressing the entire room. Why isn't anyone responding? Get that beggarly old woman out of here. Now. A young waiter approached us, someone I didn't know, a tall guy with a neat beard, wearing a white shirt and a black apron. His face was calm, professionally polite. Ma'am, what's the problem? He asked Priscilla in an even tone. A problem? Priscilla jabbed her finger in my direction. Here's the problem. This woman refuses to leave. She's already eaten. She has nothing else to do here, but she just sits there and sits there. It's obscene. It's disgusting. The waiter looked at me, then back at Priscilla. Ma'am, if a guest has paid her bill and is not disruptive, she has the right to be in the room as long as she wishes. She's disturbing my order, Priscilla shrieked. My peace. I demand that you remove her. Now. The waiter shook his head. I'm afraid I can't do that. You can't? Priscilla gasped with indignation. Why can't you? Do you work here or not? I'm a customer. I'm paying money. Do as I ask. Ma'am, the waiter sighed, and for the first time there was a slight weariness in his voice. I can't remove this lady from the room because she owns this restaurant. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Priscilla froze with her mouth open, staring at the waiter. Then she slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes widened. Her face turned white from red. What? She said. This lady is Mrs. Cribbs, the waiter repeated calmly, the owner of the restaurant, so I have no right to ask her to leave the premises. Douglas stood behind his wife, and I could see all the blood gone from his face. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There was not a sound. Priscilla continued to stare at me, unblinking. Her lips moved, but there were no words. She looked as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water into her. Mom, Douglas finally wheezed. Is this your restaurant? I nodded. Yes, but how? He shook his head as if trying to clear his thoughts. I didn't understand. You never said. You never asked, I said quietly. Priscilla continued to stand motionless. Her mouth was open and her eyes were wide. She looked as if the world had turned upside down around her, and she couldn't tell which was up and which was down. The waiter stood for a moment, then asked me, Mrs. Cribbs, is everything all right? Can I get you anything? No, thank you, I said. I'm fine. He nodded and walked away. The room slowly came back to life. People went back to their conversations and plates, though many kept glancing in our direction. Priscilla was still standing looking at me. Douglas stood nearby, pale, confused. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. Just stood there looking at me like I was a ghost. Priscilla continued to stand looking at me with an unseeing gaze. Her mouth was ajar, her breathing intermittent. Douglas stood a little behind her, one hand frozen in the air, as if he wanted to touch his wife, but didn't dare. His face was dead pale, with drops of sweat on his forehead. The silence was lingering. I sat at my table with my hands on the tabletop and watched them. Not gloating, not triumphant, just staring. Conversations gradually resumed. Dishes clinked. Someone laughed quietly. Life went on in the hall, but our little triangle stood still. At last, Priscilla blinked, several times, quickly, as if trying to wake up. Then she jerked her head, and there was an expression on her face that I couldn't immediately identify. Disbelief mixed with hope. She licked her lips. It's, it's some kind of mistake, she said, and her voice sounded hoarse. It has to be a mistake. She turned around, looking for the waiter, but he had already gone to another table. Priscilla took a step toward him, but Douglas grabbed her elbow. Priscilla, let go. She wrenched her arm free. It's a misunderstanding, just a misunderstanding. She forced herself to smile, a strained, unnatural smile. The corners of her lips trembled. Evelyn, she turned to me again, and there was a false note of amusement in her voice. What a funny joke. Really, very funny. But let's stop the act. You don't own a restaurant. How do you have, well, your... She trailed off, unable to find the words. I didn't say anything. Mom? Douglas came closer, his voice quiet, uncertain. Is it true? Do you really own this place? Yes, I answered simply. But how? He ran his hand over his face, leaving a wet trail on his forehead. I don't understand. You never? We thought... What was I thinking? I looked at him calmly. What did you think of me, Douglas? He opened his mouth, but said nothing. He just stood there, looking at me with the confusion of a child caught doing something embarrassing. Priscilla laughed nervously, sharply, harshly. It's ridiculous, she said, her voice growing higher. It's absurd. You live in an old house. You drive a wreck. You wear... She put her hand around my clothes. You wear things from cheap stores. Where'd you get the money for the restaurant? My husband and I opened it 28 years ago, I said. We worked together. After he died, I continued. But Douglas said... Priscilla turned to her husband, a flicker of accusation in her eyes. You said your mother was poor, that she only had a pension. Douglas turned even paler. I thought so. He looked at me helplessly. Mom, you never told me you had a business, that the restaurant was yours. You never asked, I repeated. You knew that Dad and I opened the restaurant. You just never asked for details. But I thought... Douglas paused before he could finish. You thought we'd failed, I finished for him. That the restaurant was closed, that I was left with nothing, didn't you? He didn't answer, but I could tell by the look on his face that I'd hit the mark. The waiter approached our table again. He was holding a carafe of water, his face calm and professional. Mrs. Cribbs, he said to me, is everything all right? Can I get you anything? No, thanks, Kevin, I said, remembering his name. Clarence had mentioned him in the last conversation, saying he'd hired a good guy. It's okay. If you need anything, let me know. He nodded with a slight smile and walked away. Priscilla gave him a look, then turned back to me. Her face had gone from pale to red, bright spots spreading across her cheeks, down her neck, her hands clenched into fists. She struggled to get the words out. You did it on purpose. You kept quiet on purpose. You purposely let us think. I didn't let you do anything, I countered calmly. I was just living my life, and you made conclusions based on what you saw, or what you wanted to see. It's despicable. Priscilla swayed as if she'd been hit. It's disgusting. You could have told. You should have said. Why? I looked at her straight on. So you'd change your attitude towards me to be more polite, or maybe friendlier? Priscilla froze, looking at me. I could tell by the look on her face that she was trying to find an answer, but couldn't. I didn't have to report my income to you, I continued, or to prove that I deserved respect. Respect doesn't depend on how fat your wallet is. At least, it shouldn't be. You humiliated me, Priscilla whispered, her voice trembling. You made me look like a fool in front of all these people. You humiliated yourself, I said quietly. I was just sitting at the table eating lunch. Douglas tried to say something, but Priscilla raised her hand sharply, silencing him. She stood there, breathing heavily, looking at me with hatred. Then suddenly she turned around, grabbed her bag from the back of the chair where they were sitting, and walked briskly toward the exit. Priscilla! Douglas rushed after her. Wait! She didn't stop. She walked across the hall, pushed open the door, and went out into the street. Douglas stopped halfway, turned to me. His face was pathetic, confused. Mom, he started, but didn't finish. I stared at him in silence. He stood for a second, then dropped his shoulders and walked toward the exit. He walked slowly, uncertainly, as if his legs were unsteady. At the door, he turned around again, opened his mouth, but didn't say anything. He just walked out. The door closed behind him with a quiet sound. I remained seated at the table, staring at the empty space where they'd both just stood. The waitress walked over to their table, starting to clear away the nearly untouched plates of appetizers, the salad that Priscilla never finished, the bread that no one had touched. She piled everything on a tray, wiped the table, and left for the kitchen. I sat with my hands on the table and felt a strange sensation in my chest. Not joy, not gloating, something else. Relief, maybe. Like a weight I'd been carrying for a long time had finally fallen from my shoulders. For 3 years I'd endured Priscilla's neglect. 3 years of keeping silent when she made her sarcastic remarks. 3 years of watching Douglas avert his eyes without interceding for me. I told myself that it didn't matter, that I was above it, that the important thing was to keep some connection with my son. But each time, that bond grew thinner and thinner, more and more formal, and now the truth has come out, not because I wanted to prove anything to them, just because of the circumstances. I went to lunch at my restaurant. They came too by chance. Priscilla acted the way she usually does, and everything fell apart like a house of cards. Kevin approached my table again. Mrs. Cribbs, sorry to bother you. Can I get you some coffee or dessert? On the house, of course. I looked at him and suddenly smiled. You know, Kevin, I could use a cup of coffee. Oh, thank you. I'll get it. He nodded and left. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window. The sun was already slipping toward the horizon, and the light was golden, soft. People were walking down the street. Life went on as usual. Somewhere out there, in a parking lot or in a car, Priscilla and Douglas were sitting, maybe arguing. Maybe they weren't talking. It was none of my business anymore. Kevin brought coffee in a white cup with a saucer that held a chocolate-covered cookie. I thanked him, took a sip. The coffee was strong, flavorful, just the way good coffee should be. I sat there, drinking slowly, savoring each sip. At a neighboring table, a middle-aged couple was talking and laughing. Next, a family with 2 children was ordering desserts. An ordinary day in a restaurant. Ordinary life. Only for me, this day was no longer ordinary. Something had changed. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I could feel the change, like a slight draft in a stuffy room. I finished my coffee, ate a cookie, picked up my bag, stood up, walked across the hall to the exit. A few people looked at me with curiosity, with sympathy, some just indifferently. I nodded goodbye to Kevin, and he smiled back. It was warm and quiet outside. I walked to my car and got behind the wheel. I started the engine, but I didn't drive right away. I just sat there, looking at the restaurant sign. My restaurant, the place that Ray and I had created together, the one I kept afloat by myself after he died. Douglas didn't know that, or didn't want to know. It's a small difference. I got out of the car and drove home. The truth came out, and what would happen now, I didn't know. But I was strangely relieved all the way home. I got home around 4 in the afternoon. I parked on the porch, got out of the car. It was a quiet, warm day. A neighbor across the street was watering the flowers in her flower bed and waved at me. I waved back and went into the house. Inside, it smelled of stale air and old wood. I opened the windows, letting in the fresh breeze. I undressed, hung my sweater on the coat rack in the hallway, and went into the kitchen. I put the kettle on, took out yesterday's apple pie from the fridge. She cut off a piece and put it on a plate. The kettle boiled. I made tea and sat by the window in the living room. I drank it slowly in small sips, looking at the street. Children on bicycles passed by, chasing each other. A dog barked somewhere. Just an ordinary weekday on my quiet street. I thought about what had happened at the restaurant, about Priscilla's face when she heard the truth, about Douglas, who stood nearby, pale and confused, not knowing what to say. The way they'd left, she first, he following like an obedient dog. I didn't feel angry, more like fatigue. For 3 years, I'd played the role they'd imposed on me, a poor pensioner in need of pity and indulgence. I didn't object. I didn't correct them because I didn't think I needed to. My life, my money, my business. Why did they need to know? But now they knew. And what to do about it next, I had no idea. The phone rang around 8 out p.m. I had already eaten dinner, washed the dishes, changed into home clothes. I was sitting in a chair with a book when the phone screen lit up. Douglas. I stared at the name on the screen for a few seconds, wondering whether to pick up. Then I sighed and answered. Hello? Mom? Douglas's voice sounded quiet, tense. Hi. Hi. Silence. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, sniffling softly. He was obviously searching for words, not knowing where to begin. How are you? He finally asked. I'm okay. And you? I'm, well. He hesitated. Look, Mom, about today. Yeah? It was unexpected. For both of us. For me and for Priscilla. I understand, I said calmly. You never told me you had a restaurant, he said, the resentment in his voice light but discernible. Why didn't you tell me? I set the book down on the table next to the chair. You knew my father and I opened the restaurant 28 years ago. I didn't hide it. Yeah, but I thought... He hesitated again. Well, I thought it was a long time ago, that the restaurant had closed or... I don't know. You never gave me any details. You never asked, I said, because you never gave me any reason to think it was anything important. His voice rose. You live in an old house, drive an old car, dress... Well, just... How was I supposed to guess you had a business? Did you have to guess? I asked. Or could you have just asked, Mom, how are you doing? What are you doing? How's your restaurant? Douglas fell silent. I heard him sigh, rustling something in the background. I thought you only had retirement, he said more quietly. That you were struggling. That you were, well, saving money. I do save money, I replied. Not because I don't have money, but because I'm not used to throwing it away. Why do I need a new car if the old one works? Why do I need a new house if I'm used to this one? But you could have told me, he repeated stubbornly, at least to me. Why? So I'd know, so that I wouldn't... He paused. So you wouldn't feel guilty? I finished for him. Or so that Priscilla would treat me differently. He didn't answer. The silence lengthened again. I waited. Priscilla didn't mean to hurt you, Douglas said at last, his voice sounding defensive. She just didn't know. If she had known, she would have... She would have what? I interrupted. Be more polite. Stop making comments about how I should live my life and what I should spend my money on. She was worried about you, Douglas objected weakly. No, I said firmly. She looked down on me because she thought I was poor and worthless, because I didn't fit her idea of what a wealthy woman should look like. That's not... It is, Douglas. And you know it. You just don't want to admit it. He stopped talking again. In the background, I could hear something. A television, I think, or a radio. Voices, music. Look, Mom. He spoke again, and there was a pleading note in his voice. Let's not make a big deal out of this situation. What happened today? Well, it was an accident. No one meant for it to happen. What exactly was an accident? I asked. The fact that you came to the restaurant? Or that Priscilla made a scene? She just didn't know, he repeated. She was in shock. You have to understand her. I understand her, I said calmly. But that doesn't mean I have to justify her behavior. She's very embarrassed right now, Douglas continued. She's very embarrassed. She's worried. She can't calm down. I remained silent, waiting to see where he was going with this. It would be good if you... He hesitated. Well, if you called her yourself, talked to her, explained that it wasn't a big deal, that you didn't hold a grudge. I felt something inside me clench. Not anger, more like disappointment. So you want me to call Priscilla and apologize? I asked. Not apologize, Douglas corrected quickly. Just, well, straighten things out. Said it was okay, that you weren't offended. It would make her feel better. Would it make me feel better? I asked. Mom, please. He spoke faster, like he was afraid I'd hang up. This is a family. We have to stick together. We don't need to turn one awkward moment into a big problem. Just call her, say a few words, and things will get better. I closed my eyes, leaning the back of my head against the back of the chair. Tired, tired of this conversation, of asking, of being understanding and compliant. No, Douglas, I said quietly. No what? I'm not calling Priscilla. I'm not going to handle the situation. I haven't done anything wrong. She was the one who was being disgusting, and you stood there and didn't say a word. Mom? 3 years, Douglas, I continued, my voice steady, calm. 3 years I endured her neglect, her remarks, her condescension. Not once did you stand up for me. Not once did you say to her, "Come on, Priscilla, that's my mother. Speak to her with respect." You were silent. You were always silent. I didn't want to create conflict, he muttered. I thought you were, well, that you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention, I said. I just kept quiet because you're my son and I didn't want to give you a choice. But you made a choice anyway. Every time you kept quiet, you chose her over me. It's not fair. It's fair, I interrupted. And you know it. What happened today is what happened. The truth came out. And now Priscilla's embarrassed. But that's her problem, Douglas, not mine. So you're just gonna say no? There's resentment in his voice. You're not even gonna try to make things right? I don't have anything to fix, I said. I act with dignity. I always have. You and Priscilla, on the other hand, are a different story. He sighed heavily. You're making this so complicated, Mom. This could have been resolved with one phone call. Then have Priscilla call me, I suggested. If it's so important to her to make things right, let her call me and say what she has to say. She won't call, Douglas muttered. You know her. She's not like that. Exactly, I said. She's not like that. And you want me to adjust to her again. He stopped talking. I could hear his breathing heavy, labored. He was obviously angry, but he didn't want to show it. Okay, he said finally. Whatever you say. I was just hoping you'd be wiser, that you'd realize that sometimes you have to make concessions for your family. I've made concessions all my life, Douglas, I said tiredly. All my life. Maybe it's time for someone else to step up. He didn't answer. I waited, giving him time to think, but he was silent. Good night, Douglas, I said quietly. Good night, he mumbled and hung up. I put the phone down on the table and leaned back in my chair. It was finally dark outside the window, the streetlights glowing dimly. The house was quiet, only the ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat still, staring into the darkness. The conversation had left an unpleasant residue, but I didn't regret my words. For the first time in a long time, I'd said what I thought. I didn't stay silent. I didn't smooth things over. I didn't adjust. I just told the truth, and it was the right thing to do. I got up, walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water. I drank it slowly, standing by the window. A neighbor's cat walked along the fence, silent and graceful. Somewhere in the distance, a car drove by. I went back into the living room, picked up a book. I sat down in my chair and opened it to the page where I'd left off. I read late into the night until my eyes began to droop. Then I turned off the light and went to bed. I fell asleep quickly, without agonizing thoughts or regrets. For the first time in years, I felt free. A week passed. Douglas didn't call. I lived my normal life. I got up at 7 in the morning, had oatmeal and fruit for breakfast, drank coffee by the window, looking out at the street. Then I did chores, read, watched the news. Tuesday I went to the pool. Wednesday I met with my friend Joan. Friday I went to the supermarket for groceries. Life flowed in a measured, relaxed way. I didn't check my phone every 5 minutes, didn't wait for a call. I just lived. Joan called Monday night, suggested we meet at a cafe on Market Street. We'd been friends for over 20 years. We'd met at a floristry course, which we'd both dropped out of after a month, realizing it wasn't our thing. But the friendship remained. Tuesday afternoon, I arrived at the cafe. Joan was already sitting at a table by the window, waving at me. A tall, full woman with a short gray haircut and a loud laugh. She had been widowed before me 15 years ago and had no children. She lived alone, worked part-time as a bookkeeper, knitting scarves and selling them at the local fair. Evie, she gave me a hug when I walked up. I haven't seen you in ages. How are you? Fine. I sat down across from her. How are you? Same old stuff. Work, knitting, cat. Joan ordered us coffee and cakes. Hey, what's up with your Douglas? I haven't seen him in a while. I shrugged. He's got his own life. Busy. Married now, right? Joan squinted. How's his wife? Priscilla? Priscilla, I confirmed. And how is she? The usual. Joan looked at me carefully. She could read between the lines, an ability that was both annoying and endearing. Did something happen? She asked me bluntly. I hesitated for a second, then told her, briefly without too much detail, about the meeting in the restaurant, about the scandal, about how Priscilla had found out the truth. Joan listened in silence, nodding occasionally. Wow, she said when I was done. What now? Nothing, I answered. Douglas called that same evening, asking me to call Priscilla and straighten things out. I said no. It's been quiet ever since. Joan leaned back in her chair, looking at me thoughtfully. You know, Evie, I never liked your sister-in-law. She's too glossy, not real. She is who she is, I said. We're just from different worlds. And Douglas? Joan frowned. What was he like? The same as always, silent. Then he tried to convince me that I should make concessions. An idiot, Joan summarized succinctly. I'm sorry, but it's true. I grinned. Maybe it was. We sat in the cafe for about 2 hours, talking about all sorts of things. Joan talked about her job, about the new cat she'd picked up on the street. I listened, put in my lines, and it was easy, simple. It was always easy with Joan. She didn't demand anything, didn't expect anything, didn't judge. When we said goodbye, she gave me a big hug. You were right not to apologize, she said. You've had enough of bending over for them. I nodded and drove home. Wednesday morning, I went to the pool. I'd been swimming 3 times a week for about 5 years, ever since the doctor said it was good for my joints and heart. I loved it, the silence underwater, the measured movement of my arms and legs, the feeling of weightlessness. I swam for about 40 minutes, then sat in the locker room, cooling down. Nearby on a bench, 2 women were discussing their grown children. One complained that her daughter rarely called. The other sighed that her son had forgotten his birthday. I listened half-heartedly and thought about Douglas. He hadn't called in 6 days. It was a record. Usually he called once a week, a 5-minute duty call, how he was doing, if everything was okay, if he needed help, a formality, a habit. But now he wouldn't say a word. I didn't know if he was offended or if he just didn't know what to say. Maybe Priscilla had forbidden him to call, or maybe he'd decided it was better to wait until things settled down. Either way, I didn't care. Strange but true, I didn't care. I didn't worry. I was just stating a fact. Wednesday evening, I was sitting in a chair with a book when I caught myself thinking about Douglas the child. Not the grown man who called me once a week and kept quiet when my wife insulted his mother, but the boy he was 30 years ago. Douglas was a laughing child. He laughed at little things, at Ray's antics, at funny pictures in books. He had blonde curls on the top of his head that wouldn't stay straight and freckles on his nose. He used to bring home stray kittens, asking to keep them, promising to take care of them himself. We'd leave them, he'd take care of them for a week, then he'd forget, and I'd take over. He was kind. He shared his toys with the neighbor kids, stood up for the younger kids on the playground, once brought home a classmate who had no lunch money, fed him, and gave him his sandwich the next day. Ray was proud of him then, saying, "He's growing up to be a man." When Douglas was about 12 years old, he found a wounded bird in the yard. He brought it home and Ray and I tried to take it out, but it died 2 days later. Douglas was crying, tucked into my shoulder, sobbing that it was his fault, that he hadn't taken good care of it. I stroked his head, telling him he'd done all he could. It didn't take long for him to calm down. I thought back to that boy and tried to figure out when he disappeared. When Douglas stopped being kind, laughing, open, gradually, I guess, not all at once. Adolescence, college, first job, disappointments, fatigue. Life changes people, that's normal. But something important in him broke, or fell asleep. That boy who stood up for the weak grew into a man who stayed silent when his wife humiliated his mother. That child who cried over a dead bird turned into a man who asked his mother to apologize to the one who behaved abominably. I tried to remember the last time I'd seen genuine kindness in Douglas, not off-duty politeness, not formal concern, but real, heartfelt kindness. I couldn't remember. It had been a long time ago. A long time ago. Maybe Priscilla had changed him, or maybe he'd changed himself and Priscilla just suited him in this new capacity. A convenient wife for a convenient life. No emotions, no complications, no need to make choices and take a stand. I thought about it and felt not pain, but a kind of detached sadness. Like I was looking at a picture of someone else's child and thinking, it's a shame he didn't grow up to be what he could have been. But it wasn't my child. My Douglas, the blonde-haired, freckled, laughing one, had disappeared long ago. This one was a stranger, familiar, but a stranger. On Thursday, I spent all day working on the house. I went through the old things in the attic, threw out what I didn't need, put in boxes what I wanted to keep. I found photo albums, looked through them. Here's Douglas at 3, standing next to Ray, both smiling. Here he is in his school uniform, first grade, front teeth falling out. Here's him on his bike. Here's him fishing at the lake. I looked at these pictures and realized they were all that was left of that Douglas. Memories frozen on paper. The rest was gone. Friday morning, I went to the supermarket. Went down the aisles with a cart. picking out groceries, vegetables, fruit, cereals, milk. A young woman with two children stood in front of me at the cash register. The boy of about 5 years old demanded something. She patiently explained that there was no money for a toy. It would have to wait until next week. The boy pouted but kept quiet. The woman stroked his head, smiled tiredly. I looked at them and thought, that's how it should be. Patiently, lovingly, but firmly. Explaining, setting boundaries, teaching them to understand that not all desires can be fulfilled. That's how I raised Douglas. But somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Friday night, I was sitting on my porch drinking tea. A neighbor across the street was walking her dog and waved at me. I waved back. The day was slipping toward sunset, the sky colored in pinks and oranges. I thought about the fact that it had been a week and Douglas still hadn't called, and I hadn't called him. We were both silent, and that silence spoke more than any words. I realized I wasn't waiting for him to call. I don't expect him to come to his senses, to apologize, to say something important. I was just moving on without that expectation. And the strange thing is, I felt better. It was like I'd lifted an invisible weight I'd been dragging around for years. Douglas made a choice. He chose comfort over truth, silence over protection, wife over mother. That's his right. I can't change him. I can't force him to be different. I can only accept it and move on. And I did. No pain, no resentment, just with clarity and fatigue. The boy I loved was gone. I'm left with a stranger with whom I share a last name and a past, but not a shared present. I finished my tea, went into the house. I locked the door, closed the curtains. I went into the bedroom, lay down in bed. I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Saturday morning, I was watering the flowers in the front flower bed when a car pulled into the driveway. A silver Toyota, familiar. I straightened up, shielding my eyes from the sun. Priscilla stepped out of the car. She was alone. No Douglas around. She was dressed strictly dark pants, light blouse, her hair in a low bun. She walked slowly, uncertainly, holding her purse in front of her with both hands like a shield. I set the watering can on the ground and waited. Priscilla came to the wicket, stopped. Her face was tense, her lips tightly pressed together. "Hello, Evelyn," she said, and her voice sounded strained. "Hello? May I come in, talk to you?" I hesitated for a second, then nodded and opened the gate. Priscilla walked through, looking around. She'd never been to my house, not once in 3 years. All the meetings were at their place, or in restaurants, or on neutral ground. "Shall we go inside?" I suggested. "Could we do it here, on the porch?" Priscilla nodded at the bench at the entrance. "If it's not too much trouble." "Okay." We sat down. Priscilla put her purse on her lap, ran her palm over the fabric of her pants, smoothing out the non-existent creases. She was silent, searching for words. I waited, staring at the flower bed. The petunias were blooming lushly, purple and white. "Evelyn," Priscilla began at last, "I came because I think we should talk about what happened last week." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. "What happened at the restaurant," Priscilla swallowed, "was a misunderstanding. Just a stupid misunderstanding. I didn't know you owned the place. I didn't know at all. If I had, I never would have." She stopped, looking away. "I'm very worried," she continued more quietly. "I'm very worried. I haven't been able to sleep well all week. I've been thinking about the way things turned out. How stupid, how ridiculous." I listened in silence. Priscilla turned to me, and there was an expression on her face that was meant to portray remorse. Her eyebrows were raised, her eyes slightly widened, her lips touched with a sad smile. "I want you to understand," she said, "that I didn't mean to hurt you. I never did. It's just, well, you know how I am. Sometimes I say things without thinking. It's my problem, I know. She was silent, waiting for an answer. I remained silent. Evelyn, Priscilla leaned closer. Let's just forget about it. Blot it out of our minds. Like it never happened. We're family, after all. It's no good ruining our relationship over one awkward moment. One awkward moment? I asked calmly. Priscilla blinked. Yeah. What happened at the restaurant? And the rest of it? I looked at her straight on. The 3 years before that? All those remarks, all that condescension? Was that one awkward moment too? Priscilla straightened, and irritation flashed across her face, quick as a shadow. I don't know what you mean, she said coldly. I've always been polite to you. Polite? I grinned. You call the way you talked to me polite? The way you looked at me? The way you made it clear that you thought I was a penniless old woman unworthy of your attention? That's not true, Priscilla shook her head. You're exaggerating. I was just concerned about you, about your well-being. That's normal, isn't it? No, I said. It wasn't concern. It was contempt. Priscilla pressed her lips together. Her fingers gripped the handle of her purse, her knuckles turning white. All right, she said. Let's say I've been harsh at times, but you have to understand my position. I've seen how you live. That old house, the old car, the simple clothes. What was I to think? Of course I thought it was hard for you, that you save money on everything. So you let yourself humiliate me? I didn't, Priscilla flared up. I was just telling the truth, or what I thought was the truth. You said what you wanted to say, I countered, because it made you feel superior. You looked down on me and enjoyed it. Priscilla stood up abruptly, walked across the porch, stopped at the railing, looking out at the street. Her shoulders were tense, her back straight. You know, Evelyn, she said without turning around, I came here in good faith. I was trying to make things right, but you don't seem interested in that. What exactly am I not interested in? I asked. In pretending it never happened? Smiling and pretending everything's fine? In being a grown-up and forgiving? Priscilla turned around, and her voice got louder. Everyone makes mistakes. I've admitted mine. What more do you want? You didn't admit the mistake, I said calmly. You said it was a misunderstanding. That's different. Priscilla stared at me, breathing hard. A blush spread across her cheeks, down her neck. She was obviously struggling to hold it together. Okay, she said slowly. Okay, I apologize for what I said in the restaurant, for the way I acted. Are you happy? No, I said, because you're not sorry. You just want things to go back to the way they were, so I can be quiet again and you can keep doing what you've been doing. Priscilla froze, looking at me. Then she laughed, a short, angry laugh. Unbelievable, she said. Just unbelievable. I'm here, trying to make things right, and you're interrogating me. You act like I committed a crime. You've behaved abominably, I said. 3 years. It's not a crime, but it's no small thing. And you've behaved perfectly, haven't you? Priscilla stepped closer. You who hid from your own son that you owned a restaurant? Who let us think you were a pauper? Isn't that cheating? I wasn't hiding anything, I answered. Douglas knew that Ray and I had opened the restaurant. He just never asked what happened to him. Never asked. Because you never gave him a reason to, Priscilla shouted. You lived like a poor man. You looked like a poor man. How were we to guess? You didn't have to guess, I said tiredly. You should have just treated me with respect, whether I had money or not. Priscilla was silent. She stood there, breathing hard, clenching and unclenching her fists. Her face showed that she was struggling with herself, trying not to break down completely. After all, she said at last, and her voice became icy, Douglas is my husband. His peace of mind is more important to me than your resentment. I didn't come here for you. I came here for him because he's worried about this situation. I see, I nodded. He wants us to reconcile, Priscilla continued. He wants things to go back to the way they were, and I'm willing to go along with it. I'm willing to let go of the grudges, to turn a blind eye to your behavior. I'm willing to pretend it never happened. For him. How noble of you, I said. Priscilla narrowed her eyes. Don't be sarcastic. I'm doing what a good wife should do. I'm looking out for my husband, for his comfort. And you? You only think about yourself. I think about the fact that I've endured your neglect for years, I said quietly. Silent, unresponsive, swallowing resentment. For Douglas. So I wouldn't ruin his life, so he wouldn't have to choose. But now I was tired of being patient. Then don't, Priscilla said. But don't expect us to run to you and apologize. It's your own fault. You hid the truth. You let the situation unfold as it did. So don't play the victim. I wasn't hiding anything, I repeated. No one asked. No one was interested. Priscilla snorted. How convenient. Blame it on us. We didn't ask, you see, and of course it wasn't your fault. I stood up. I was tired of this conversation, of her voice, of trying to make me look guilty. Priscilla, I said calmly, you didn't come here to make up. You came here to make sure I knew my place, to make me realize that I should keep quiet and not resent you. But it's not gonna work. Fuck you, Priscilla snapped, her face contorting. Who are you anyway? A lonely old woman clinging to her son. You have no one but him, and he has me. I'm his wife. I'm his family. And if he has to choose, he'll choose me over you. I looked at her in silence. Priscilla's breathing was ragged, her eyes glistening with anger or tears. Finished? I asked quietly. Priscilla grabbed her purse, turned, and walked briskly toward the wicket. She opened it with a jerk, went through, slammed it so hard that the hinges jingled. She got into the car, started the engine, and drove off with a squeal of tires. I stood on the porch, staring after her. The neighbor across the street looked out the window when she heard the noise, then disappeared back in. I sighed, returned to the watering can, and continued to water the flowers. My hands didn't shake. My heart was beating smoothly. I felt only tiredness and a strange relief. Everything had been said now. All the cards were open. No loose ends, no lies. Priscilla had shown her true colors, and I showed mine. We both knew there would be no reconciliation, not because I don't want to forgive. It's because there's nothing to forgive. She's not sorry. I'm not to blame. It's as simple as that. After Priscilla left, I went back to my work. I watered the flowers, swept the porch, made dinner. It was the usual measured, quiet routine. But there was a thought I couldn't get out of my head. The thought that it was time to make a decision. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and just sat staring out the window. The neighbor's cat was dozing on the fence with his paw hanging down. The wind moved the branches of an old maple tree in the yard. It was an ordinary day, unremarkable, but something inside me had changed, shifted, settled into a new position. I didn't want to wait any longer, waiting for Douglas to come to his senses, to call, to say something important, waiting for things to somehow work themselves out. For 3 years, I'd been patient, silent, hopeful. And now I realize there's nothing to hope for. Hope is a good thing when you have something to fall back on. But when it's fueled only by your stubborn desire to see what isn't there, it becomes self-delusion. Douglas made a choice. He chose his wife. He chose comfort. He chose to ignore what was happening. That's his right. I can't change him. I can't force him to be different. I can only accept it and move on. And I chose to move on. Monday morning, I called my lawyer. Mr. Glenn had been handling my affairs for 15 years, drafting contracts, reviewing restaurant paperwork. helping with tax issues. An older man with a gray mustache and a calm voice, always punctual and meticulous. Ray respected him, said he was the kind of man you could trust. "Mrs. Cribbs," he said when he heard my voice, "what can I do for you?" "I need to change my will," I said. "Can we meet this week?" He didn't ask any questions over the phone, for which I was grateful. "Sure. Tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock would be okay with you?" "Yes, thank you." I hung up the phone and sat down to think about exactly what I was going to say to him. I had to be clear. I had to be specific. I took out my notebook and started writing. Restaurant to Clarence, the house to the animal charity. Douglas, a token amount and a note. I reread it, added a few clarifications, put the notebook away. I spent the rest of the day doing the usual things, but my thoughts kept returning to tomorrow's meeting. There was no anxiety or doubt, just clarity and calm. I knew I was doing the right thing. On Tuesday, I arrived at his office, a small space in the center of town, 2 offices and a reception area. The receptionist, a young woman with glasses, said hello and invited me to sit down. A few minutes later, she escorted me to Mr. Glenn. He got up from his desk and shook my hand. It was a firm, dry handshake. "Have a seat, Mrs. Cribbs. Tea, coffee?" "No, thank you." He sat down across from her, took out a notebook and pen. Slow, methodical movements. That was his way of working. No fuss, no hurry. "So, you want to make changes to the will." "What kind of changes?" I took out of my bag my notebook. I smoothed it out on my lap so I wouldn't forget anything important. "I want to leave the restaurant to Clarence Weaver, my manager. He's been there 8 years, knows the ins and outs, runs the place with integrity. The restaurant should go to him, with all the property, all the accounts, all the contracts." Mr. Glenn took notes, nodding. "Clarence Weaver, the full legal name of the restaurant?" I did. He wrote it down, went over a few details, the address of the establishment, the registration information. "I'd like to donate the house to a homeless animal foundation," I continued. "The one on Oak Street. Let them sell it and use the money for their own needs, or keep it as a shelter, as they see fit. Do you know the full name of the foundation?" I did, and he wrote it down. Then he looked up from his notebook. "And the sun?" I was silent for a second, looking out the window. Tree branches swayed outside the window. Cars drove by. "I'm leaving Douglas $5,000 and a note." Mr. Glenn looked up from his notebook and looked at me carefully. "Only $5,000? Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I answered firmly. He looked at me for a few more seconds, then nodded. He didn't ask me any questions, didn't discourage me or advise me. He just accepted my decision and wrote it down. "You'll write a note separately, and I'll enclose it with the will in a sealed envelope. Anything else?" "No, that's it." We went over the details, how the paperwork would be done, what certificates would be needed, when everything would be ready. Mr. Glenn said he'd have the draft ready by the end of the week, and I'd come, check it out, sign it. He explained everything in a clear, understandable way. No unnecessary legal terms. "If you change your mind or want to change anything, call me anytime." He said goodbye. "Thank you. I won't change my mind." I left the office and got in my car. I started the engine, but I didn't drive right away. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, looking at the storefronts across the street. I felt strangely relieved, as if I'd lifted a weight off my shoulders that I'd been carrying for years. At home, I sat down at the table and took out a blank sheet of paper. I stared at it for a long time, searching for words. What should I write to Douglas? A long explanation? A list of grievances? Accusations? No, none of that. He already knows everything, or doesn't want to know, which is the same thing. I took a pen and wrote succinctly, "Douglas, you made a choice. I respect it and make mine. Live happily ever after. Mom." I reread it several times. The words are simple, unadorned, unembellished, unemotional. Just what I needed. I folded it in half, put it in an envelope, sealed it. I wrote on the envelope, "To Douglas." I put it in my desk drawer. The next few days went by as usual. I did chores around the house, went to the store, saw Joan. I didn't tell her anything about the will. I didn't want to discuss it, explain it, listen to advice. It was my decision, and mine alone. On Friday, I went to see Mr. Glenn again. He handed me a folder of documents, laid them out on the table, explained where to sign. I read every line carefully, even though the legal language was dry and confusing. But the point was clear. Everything was just the way I wanted it. I signed all the right pages. Mr. Glenn stamped the signatures, dated them, put the originals in the safe. "Would you like to keep a copy?" he asked. "Yes, please." He made copies of all the documents, put them in a separate folder, handed them to me. "Keep them in a safe place. If you need anything, call me." "Thank you." I left the office with the folder under my arm. I got in my car, put it on the seat next to me. I drove home, and the whole way I felt light, almost weightless. It was as if I had taken off the heavy backpack I had been carrying for years. It's all settled now. Everything is in its place. At home, I put the folder with the documents in the drawer of the desk, locked it with the key. I put the key in a box on the shelf. I sat by the window with my tea, looking out at the street. Children were playing ball in the neighboring lot. A woman was walking her dog. The letter carrier was delivering letters on his bicycle. An ordinary fall day, ordinary life. I wondered if Douglas would ever find out about the will. After I die, when Mr. Glenn announces its contents, Douglas would be surprised, maybe offended. Priscilla will be furious. She must have been counting on the inheritance, the restaurant, the house. They'll discuss, they'll judge, they'll resent. Maybe they'll try to contest the will. But it won't affect me. I will be somewhere far away, where there are no resentments, claims, and disappointments, and they'll be left to live with their choices, just as I'm living with mine now. Clarence will get the restaurant. He's earned it. 8 years of honest work, dedication to the business Ray and I built. He loves this place, knows every detail, every loyal customer. He'll keep it going, keep it, maybe expand it. The restaurant will live on, feed people, give jobs. It's the right thing to do. It's what Ray would want. The Animal Foundation gets a home. It's a good thing, a necessary thing. I've always felt sorry for stray dogs and cats, fed those who wandered onto my property, left bowls of water on my porch. Now, let the money from the sale of the house help those in need. They will build a new shelter or repair the old one, buy medicine and food. It'll do some good, and Douglas gets $5,000 and a note, a symbolic sum, a symbolic goodbye. Not out of revenge, not out of resentment, just because it's the honest thing to do. He walked away from me, chose a different path. I recognized that choice and I let him go. 5,000 is more than nothing, but less than he probably expected. Enough to understand. My life continued in a calm, measured way. I went to the pool on Tuesdays and Thursdays, swimming my laps, enjoying the quiet underwater. Met with Joan once a week, drinking coffee, chatting about nothing. I read books, detectives, novels, memoirs. I tended the garden, prepared supplies for the winter, made jam, pickled vegetables. Every 2 weeks she called Clarence to discuss business at the restaurant. He told me about the new dishes on the menu, about the renovations he was planning for the winter, about the good feedback from the customers. His voice always sounded animated, enthusiastic. He loved his job, and it showed. Clarence didn't know about the will, and I didn't tell him. When the time comes, he will. I hope he'll be pleased. I hope he'll carry on as honestly and faithfully as he's done all these years. Douglas never called. It was 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. Silence on both sides. I didn't worry. I didn't feel sad. I didn't grab the phone in a moment of weakness. I just lived, day by day, week by week. Sometimes I thought about him, not the grown up Douglas who kept quiet when his wife humiliated his mother, but the boy he'd been long ago, about the blond, laughing child who brought home wounded birds and cried when they died, about the teenager who shared his lunch with a poor classmate, about the young man who helped Ray in the garage, getting dirty in the oil and laughing when his father scolded him for being sloppy. That Douglas was dear to me. I loved him with all my heart, was proud of him, rejoiced in his every word and deed. But he's gone. He grew up, changed, became different. And this other Douglas of today was a stranger to me, familiar but alien. I wasn't angry with him. I didn't resent him. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I just accepted it as a fact. People change, sometimes not for the better. That's life, and there's no escaping it. One evening, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a warm blanket. Fall had taken over. The evenings were cool and windy. I drank hot tea with honey and watched the sunset. The sky was colored in purple and golden tones. The clouds floated slowly, changing shape. The air smelled of fallen leaves, of dampness, of approaching winter. I thought about Ray, about what he'd say when he found out about everything that had happened. He'd probably be upset. Douglas was his only son, and he loved him as much as I did. Proud when he went to college, happy when he got a job. But Ray was a fair man, tough when he had to be. He wouldn't make excuses for Douglas, wouldn't urge me to be patient. He'd just sigh, give me a hug, say, "You did good, Evie. You did the best you could. Now live for yourself." I finished my tea, got up and went into the house. I locked the door, closed the curtains. I went into the bedroom, changed into my nightgown, got into bed, covered herself with a blanket, closed her eyes. No thoughts swirled in my head, no regrets gnawed at me. It was quiet, peaceful. I knew I had done the right thing, not out of revenge, not out of resentment, just out of respect for myself, for my life, for what I'd done over the years. Douglas made a choice. I respected him and made mine. We were both now living with the consequences. He, with his family, with Priscilla, with the comfort he chose over the truth. Me, alone, but free from the need to pretend, to be silent, to tolerate. Sometimes at night I remembered him, that boy, blonde-haired, freckled, kind. He was dear to me. I loved him as only a mother can. But he was in the past, in the pictures in the attic, in memories that grew fuzzier with each passing year. The present Douglas was someone else, someone I knew but didn't understand, someone who had chosen the path of least resistance and followed it without looking back. I let him go, not with pain, not with screaming, not with accusations. I just let him go, like letting go of a bird that has grown up and no longer needs a nest. Let it fly wherever it wants to go. I no longer held, no longer called, no longer waited for him to return. Life went on. In the morning, I got up, made coffee, looked out the window at the awakening city. In the afternoon, I did things, met people, read, walked in the park, fed the ducks in the pond. In the evening, I sat by the window, drinking tea, thinking about all sorts of things, the weather, a book I was reading, a new recipe I wanted to try. Sometimes I thought about Douglas, but less and less, shorter and shorter, like thinking about someone who had once been important but was now a part of the past, with warmth, with a slight sadness, but no pain, no acute longing. I moved on, calmly, measuredly, without resentment or regret. My restaurant worked, brought income, fed people. My house stood on a quiet street surrounded by a garden I loved. My life flowed on, not bright, not tumultuous, but mine, honest, dignified, free. And that was enough.